The first indication that my career at Meridian Technologies was about to implode came when Sandra from HR texted me at 9:17 a.m. "Marco wants lunch with you at Vesuvio's. 12:30, says it's important." I stared at my phone, a familiar knot of dread settling in my stomach. Marco DeVries, our CEO of 3 years, didn't do casual lunches. In the 5 years I'd served as Chief Operations Officer at Meridian, he had invited me to exactly 2 meals, once when he was newly hired and assessing the executive team, and once when he desperately needed my help convincing the board to approve his strategic overhaul. Did he say what it's about? I texted back, my fingers trembling slightly. 3 gray dots pulsed for what seemed like an eternity. "Sorry, Alex. Just passing along the message." I set my phone down on my desk and gazed out the window at Seattle's skyline, partially obscured by the melancholy October rain. At 42, I had poured my heart and soul into building Meridian's operations from a chaotic startup environment into a streamlined machine. Our enterprise software solutions weren't the sexiest products in tech, but our client retention rate of 97% was absolutely unheard of in the industry. My passionate team of 78 people across implementation, customer success, and technical support formed the backbone of what our clients actually experienced after the sales team's promises. A gentle knock at my door broke my anxious reverie. Diane, my fiercely loyal deputy director of customer success, stood in the doorway, a tablet in hand. "The PharmaBlock implementation is officially green across all departments," she said, her usual intensity softened by a rare, genuine smile. "Final sign-off just came in. That's 6 weeks ahead of schedule," I replied, forcing enthusiasm into my voice while hiding my inner turmoil. "The team knocked it out of the park." "You mean your completely restructured implementation process knocked it out of the park," she corrected warmly. "Before your changes, this would have been a 6-month nightmare." I nodded gratefully, thoughts still tangled around Marco's mysterious lunch invitation. "Make sure everyone on the team gets recognized. Kyle led this one beautifully." After Diane left, I pulled up the company's organizational chart, something I rarely needed to reference. There it was, under the Executive Leadership section, Alexander Chin, Chief Operations Officer. 5 departments reported to me, representing almost 40% of the company's workforce. I clicked through quarterly reports, customer satisfaction metrics, implementation timelines, all showing steady, impressive improvement over the past 3 years. Whatever this lunch was about, I would come prepared, armed with undeniable evidence of my value. Vesuvio's was Marco's preferred restaurant for what he called meaningful conversations, which typically meant delivering news he knew wouldn't be well received. The elegant Italian restaurant's private dining rooms had witnessed numerous executive departures and reorganization announcements. I arrived 10 minutes early, my heart pounding, but Marco was already there, nursing what appeared to be a scotch despite the early hour. Across from him sat a young man I recognized but couldn't immediately place, sandy blonde hair, designer glasses, a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Alex, right on time," Marco stood, gesturing to the chair beside him rather than across, a subtle power move that positioned me and the young man opposite each other. "You've met Elliot Garrison, I believe? Richard's nephew." Ah! Recognition clicked into place like a painful puzzle piece. Richard Garrison, majority owner and chairman of Meridian's board. I had seen Elliot at the holiday party last December, where he had spent most of the evening talking loudly about his Stanford MBA while embarrassingly misidentifying key company personnel. "We met briefly," I said, extending my hand across the table, hiding my growing unease. Elliot's handshake was exactly what I expected. Too firm, too prolonged, attempting to communicate dominance he hadn't earned. "Alex, great to see you again. I've been hearing about your operations team for weeks now." His smile never reached his eyes. The waiter appeared and Marco ordered another scotch. I requested water, my appetite suddenly vanished. Elliot asked for some obscure wine the restaurant didn't carry, then settled for what the sommelier recommended, nodding as though he had actually recognized the vintage. Alex, Marco began once drinks arrived, not bothering with menus. You've done remarkable work with operations over the past 5 years. Past tense. My stomach tightened painfully. Our customer retention metrics speak for themselves, I replied evenly, masking my rising panic. The new implementation framework has reduced time to value by 42% while improving client satisfaction scores. Marco nodded impatiently. Absolutely, and the board recognizes those achievements. That's why this conversation is particularly difficult. He took a deliberate sip of his scotch, making me wait in agonizing silence. A tactic I'd seen him use countless times in negotiations. Meridian is entering an exciting new growth phase, he continued with practiced smoothness. The board has approved our expansion into Asia-Pacific markets, and we're restructuring several key departments to align with our new direction. I kept my face neutral despite the bitter taste of betrayal rising in my throat. The Asia-Pacific expansion had been my passionate project for the past 8 months. My team had meticulously built the implementation roadmap, created localization frameworks, and established the support infrastructure. As part of this restructuring, Marco continued, avoiding direct eye contact, we're consolidating operations under a new role, Chief Experience Officer. This position will oversee operations, customer success, and our new international implementation teams. I nodded slowly, clinging to diminishing hope. That makes sense given the expansion. When do you want me to transition to the new title? Marco and Elliot exchanged telling glances. Actually, Marco said, finally meeting my eyes, the board has decided to bring in fresh perspective for this role. Elliot has extensive international experience and a strong vision for transforming our customer journey. The words hung in the air like toxic gas. I turned to Elliot, who had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable before his expression shifted to practiced sympathy. I spent 2 years in Shanghai with McKinsey's digital transformation practice, Elliot offered confidently. And my MBA focused on international business operations. 2 years? With a consulting firm. Versus my decade building Meridian's actual operations from the ground up with blood, sweat, and tears. I see, I said, my voice sounding distant through the heartbreaking roar in my ears. And what happens to my current role? Marco cleared his throat awkwardly. That's what we need to discuss. The COO position is being eliminated as part of the restructuring. We'd like to offer you a transition package. The rest of lunch passed in a blur of corporate euphemisms. Organizational flattening. Strategic realignment. Generous separation agreement. I barely registered the details as Marco outlined 6 months of severance, accelerated vesting of some stock options, and an opportunity to consult during the transition. When Marco excused himself to take a call, likely scheduled deliberately, Elliot leaned forward with feigned warmth. I want you to know I deeply respect the foundation you've built, he said, his sincerity as authentic as a $3 bill. I hope you'll consider the consulting arrangement. Your institutional knowledge would be invaluable. Translation: I need you to explain how everything works before I take full credit and destroy what you've built. When does this take effect? I asked, struggling to maintain composure. Immediately, he replied with a smug smile. HR will meet you back at the office to collect your credentials and arrange for your personal items. By the time Marco returned, I had regained just enough composure to ask the only question that mattered to my heart. Does my team know? My voice cracked slightly despite my efforts. Marco had the grace to look uncomfortable. We'll be announcing the reorganization at 3. Your direct reports will be meeting with Elliot this afternoon. I nodded, stood, and extended my hand first to Marco, then to Elliot. Professional to the end, despite the crushing weight in my chest. I wish you both the best of luck, I said, meaning the exact opposite. You're going to need it. The lonely walk back to Meridian's offices gave me time to process my shattered reality. 15 passionate years with the company, 5 as Director of Implementation, then 5 more as VP of Operations before being named COO 3 years ago. All callously ended over lunch by a CEO who wouldn't last another year and an owner's nephew with a resume thinner than economy toilet paper. Sandra was waiting in my office, her expression a mixture of professional detachment and genuine heartfelt regret. "I'm so sorry, Alex," she whispered before switching to her official HR voice to outline the exit process. I had 30 humiliating minutes to collect personal belongings while she watched. My laptop would remain. My phone would be wiped remotely once I left the building. The security guard hovering awkwardly by the door would escort me out like a criminal. As I packed the few personal items from my office, cherished framed photos, hard-earned industry awards, a small collection of treasured desk toys from various team celebrations, I spotted Kyle through the glass wall, heading toward the conference room with other implementation managers. They had no idea what devastating news was coming. I sent a quick text to Diane. "Emergency. Call me after your 3 p.m. meeting." My personal number. I knew she would understand the dire significance. The security guard, Jim, who I'd always greeted by name every morning for 5 years, looked mortified as he walked beside me to the elevator. "This isn't right, Mr. Chen," he muttered as the doors closed. "Everyone knows what you've done for this place." I nodded, unable to form words around the painful lump in my throat. In the lobby, I paused to look back at the company I had helped build with such devotion, wondering if this was the last time I would see it from the inside. "Good luck, Jim," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Watch out for yourself." My condo felt eerily alien at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the middle of the living room, still in my work clothes, holding the sad little box of office mementos. The silence was deafening and cruel. I set down the box and moved mechanically to the kitchen, where I opened a bottle of bourbon I'd been saving for a special occasion. Getting brutally fired by an incompetent CEO to make room for a nepotism hire seemed special enough in its own twisted way. 2 fingers of bourbon later, my phone buzzed with shocked texts from stunned colleagues. The announcement had gone out. By 3:30, my phone was ringing nonstop. I ignored all calls except one. "What the absolute hell?" Diane hissed furiously when I answered. She was clearly in her car, voice low but intense with outrage. "They're replacing you with Richard's man-child nephew? The one who couldn't even remember the difference between our enterprise and professional product tiers at the Christmas party." "That's the one," I confirmed, a bitter laugh escaping me. "How did the team take it?" "They're absolutely shell-shocked. Kyle looks like someone shot his dog." Marco presented it as this amazing new direction, but everyone could read between the lines. She paused, her breathing heavy with emotion. "They're calling it a promotion for you, special advisory role focusing on strategic initiatives." "Are you consulting?" I laughed bitterly. "They want me to train my replacement for a fraction of my salary with no benefits or job security. What do you think?" "I think they just made the biggest mistake of their corporate lives," she replied with fierce loyalty. "What are you going to do?" It was the haunting question I'd been avoiding since leaving Vesuvio's. What was I going to do? At 42, I wasn't worried about finding another job. My track record spoke for itself. But Meridian had been my professional home, my passion for 15 years. I had built my department from nothing. My team was family. "I don't know yet," I admitted, the weight of uncertainty crushing me. "But I won't leave you all hanging. Give me a few days to figure things out." After hanging up, I poured another bourbon and opened my laptop. First stop, LinkedIn, where I updated my profile status to open to opportunities and posted a carefully worded announcement of my departure from Meridian that thanked my team without mentioning the heartbreaking circumstances. Then I opened a document and began typing, "Meridian Technologies Operations Critical Knowledge Transfer." If I was going to consult during this transition, I would do it on my terms, not as Elliot's private tutor. My phone continued to buzz throughout the evening as news spread like wildfire. Around 8 p.m. a text came through from a number I didn't recognize. Alex, it's Richard Garrison. Can we meet tomorrow? My office, 10 a.m. Richard Garrison, the company's founder and majority shareholder. The man whose nephew had just been handed my job on a silver platter. I stared at the message in disbelief for 5 full minutes before responding with shaking fingers. I'll be there. Garrison Investments occupied the top floor of a prestigious downtown Seattle high-rise, 16 blocks from Meridian's more modest offices. Unlike Meridian's open floor plan and casual tech atmosphere, Richard's domain was all old-school power, dark wood, leather furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows with commanding views of the city I loved. His assistant, a woman I'd met at various company functions, greeted me with professional warmth. He's expecting you, Mr. Chin. Can I get you anything? No, thank you, Marie. I'm fine. My voice betrayed none of the anxious anticipation I felt. Richard was standing at the window when I entered, his back to the door. At 68, he maintained the trim build and erect posture of his naval officer days. When he turned, I noted the lines around his eyes had deepened since I'd last seen him at the annual shareholder meeting 6 months ago. Alex, thank you for coming. He gestured to a sitting area rather than his imposing desk. I imagine yesterday was incredibly difficult. I took a seat across from him, maintaining eye contact despite my inner turmoil. Unexpected, I replied neutrally. But business decisions aren't always communicated ideally. A thin smile crossed his face. Diplomatic as always. That's one of your remarkable strengths. He leaned forward slightly. I want to hear your perspective on what happened. I considered my words carefully. Marco informed me that the company is restructuring operations as part of the Asia-Pacific expansion. My position has been eliminated and Elliot will be taking over my departments under a new title. And what do you think about that decision? His piercing gaze studied me intently. Was this a trap? I studied Richard's expression, looking for signs of the true purpose behind this mysterious meeting. Finding none, I decided honesty was my only play. I think it's a terrible mistake, I said flatly. The Asia-Pacific expansion is incredibly complex. My team has spent 8 painstaking months building the implementation framework. Bringing in new leadership without operational experience at Meridian risks disrupting client onboarding, support processes, and ultimately retention rates. I paused, then added with resignation, "But it's not my company." Richard nodded slowly. Actually, that's part of what I wanted to discuss. How much do you know about Meridian's ownership structure? Alex, you're the majority shareholder at around 55%. Marco holds about 7%. The rest is split between venture capital firms and smaller investors, including some early employees. That was true until yesterday, Richard said, his expression darkening. For the past year, I've been gradually reducing my position. As of market close yesterday, I own 34% of Meridian. Still the largest single shareholder, but no longer controlling interest. I processed this shocking information. So the board makeup is changing, Richard confirmed grimly. Marco orchestrated a quiet coalition with Westridge Ventures and a few other investors. He now effectively controls the voting direction of about 40% of shares. He leaned back. Yesterday's decision about your position came from Marco and the board. I was outvoted. The pieces fell into place with stunning clarity. And Elliot? Richard's expression hardened. Is my nephew, yes. But this wasn't my doing. Marco approached him 2 months ago, cultivating a relationship outside of company channels. He offered Elliot the position without consulting me, knowing I wouldn't approve but couldn't stop it. Why are you telling me this? I asked, genuinely confused and increasingly intrigued. Because I built Meridian from nothing 18 years ago, Richard said, his voice suddenly fierce with passion. Marco sees my company as a stepping stone to boost his reputation before moving on to a larger CEO role. He's slashing operational costs to artificially inflate short-term profitability, positioning for either acquisition or a secondary offering where he can cash out. He stood and moved to a sidebar, pouring 2 glasses of water. The Asia-Pacific expansion is real, but it's being done recklessly. Timelines cut in half, implementation staff reduced, support teams consolidated. Your replacement was chosen not for competence but for compliance. With respect, Richard, I said, accepting the water, why should I care? I've been ruthlessly removed from the equation. Richard smiled, a real smile this time. Because I'm not done fighting for my company. And neither should you be. He handed me a folder from the side table. Inside was a detailed severance agreement, far more generous than what Marco had outlined. Triple the severance period, full vesting of all stock options, and a consulting agreement at my full COO salary for 6 months. This is substantial, I said carefully, my heart racing. It's fair, Richard countered with conviction. And strategic. The consulting agreement is with Garrison Investments, not Meridian. I want you to document everything, every process, every client relationship, every potential issue with the Asia-Pacific rollout. Consider it your operational Bible. I looked up from the papers. I don't understand. This won't help Meridian if I'm consulting with you personally. Phase 1 is documentation, Richard said with a knowing glint in his eye. Phase 2 depends on how the next 3 months unfold. Marco is making promises to the board and investors that I don't believe he can keep, especially with your team being dismantled. The implication was crystal clear. Richard was positioning for a countermove and he wanted me as an ally. I'll need time to review this with my lawyer, I said, closing the folder, trying to hide my racing thoughts. Of course. Take 48 hours. Richard stood, signaling the end of our meeting. At the door, he paused. One more thing, Alex. Marco's directed that you have no contact with current Meridian employees during the transition. Says it would complicate the restructuring. I felt my jaw tighten in outrage. That wasn't mentioned yesterday. No, I imagine it wasn't. The official communication will come from HR today. Richard's expression was unreadable. Just something to be aware of as you consider your options. I spent the next 2 days consulting with my attorney and weighing Richard's intriguing offer against other options. Several recruiters had already reached out with potential positions, including a tempting COO role at a rising competitor. But Richard's proposal nagged at me, not just the generous terms, but the underlying strategy that promised vindication. On the 3rd morning, I called Richard's assistant and accepted his offer. By afternoon, the paperwork was signed and I had received the first consulting payment. Phase 1 began immediately with renewed purpose. Creating the operational Bible became my new full-time job. I documented every process, every vendor relationship, every client implementation quirk with meticulous detail. I outlined the Asia-Pacific expansion strategy in minute detail, including contingency plans for the various corners I suspected Marco would cut with reckless abandon. Meanwhile, I watched from the outside as Meridian began to transform. LinkedIn updates from former team members told the painful story. Diane resigned after 2 agonizing weeks under Elliot's incompetent leadership. Kyle was repositioned to a lesser role. New hires with connections to Elliot appeared in senior positions. 1 month after my departure, Meridian announced its official entry into Asia-Pacific markets, beginning with Australia. The press release quoted Elliot extensively about his visionary approach to client experience without mentioning that the entire framework had been painstakingly built by my loyal team. 2 weeks later, I received a frantic text from Kyle, PharmaBlock expansion failing. New process abandoned. Working weekends to save it. I deleted the message immediately, respecting the non-contact directive while filing the information mentally. Richard and I met weekly. He rarely commented on my documentation, but occasionally asked pointed questions about specific clients or processes. After one such meeting, he casually mentioned that Meridian's stock had dropped 8% following rumors of implementation problems with a major APAC client. Darwin Medical Group, I said immediately. They have unique compliance requirements that aren't standard in our Australian deployment package. Richard nodded, impressed. Yes, that's the one. 3 months after my heartbreaking firing, the picture had become painfully clearer. Meridian was struggling desperately with the expansion. 2 major implementation failures had made embarrassing industry news. Client retention, previously at a stellar 97%, had plummeted to 91% and was trending downward. The stock was down a devastating 23% from its peak. At our scheduled meeting, Richard got straight to the point. Marco has called an emergency board meeting for next Friday. He's blaming the transition challenges on legacy systems and outdated processes that he inherited. I couldn't help laughing bitterly. The processes that achieved record client satisfaction? Exactly. He's positioning for a major restructuring, more layoffs, primarily from your former departments, and a pivot to a lighter implementation model that relies more on clients self-configuring. I winced. That's precisely the opposite of what enterprise clients need. They require hands-on, personalized implementation. I know. Richard slid a document across the table with a determined expression. Phase 2 begins now. The document outlined Richard's brilliant counter-strategy. Over the past 3 months, while I had been documenting operations, Richard had been quietly increasing his ownership stake. With market prices dropping, he had managed to reacquire shares, bringing his ownership back to 41%. He had also been meeting individually with board members and key investors, sharing deep concerns about the company's direction. The emergency board meeting works perfectly in our favor, Richard explained with quiet confidence. Marco intends to present his restructuring plan as the solution to problems he created. I'll be offering an alternative. That alternative, detailed in the document, was nothing short of a leadership coup. Richard would propose replacing Marco with a new CEO, restructuring the executive team, and implementing my documented strategies to stabilize the business. Who's the new CEO candidate? I asked, my heart pounding with anticipation. Richard looked at me steadily. You are. I blinked in astonishment. Me? I've never been a CEO. No, but you've been the operational backbone of this company for a decade. You understand our clients, our products, and our people better than anyone. More importantly, you care deeply about Meridian's long-term success, not just quarterly numbers. I sat back, absorbing the stunning proposal. Marco won't go quietly. Neither will Elliot. No, they won't, Richard agreed grimly. That's why this needs to be executed perfectly. The plan was methodical. Richard had secured tentative support from 2 key board members and was working on a third, which would give us a majority vote. The presentation would contrast Meridian's performance before and after my departure, highlighting the correlation between operational changes and declining metrics. Most crucially, Richard had been quietly meeting with our top 10 clients, ostensibly as the chairman checking in on their satisfaction. The feedback had been overwhelming. Service quality had declined dramatically, implementation timelines were being missed, and several were seriously considering not renewing. I've asked these clients if they would consider staying if the operational leadership changed, Richard said. 9 of 10 said yes. 7 specifically mentioned you by name. The pieces were falling into place beautifully, but one question remained. And Elliot? What happens with your nephew? Richard's expression hardened with painful family conflict. Elliot made his choice when he aligned with Marco behind my back. He'll be offered a severance package and a recommendation for a position better suited to his experience level. The severity in his tone told me everything I needed to know about family dynamics in the Garrison household. The board meeting is in 9 days, Richard continued. I need your decision within 48 hours. As I drove home, thoughts swirled through my mind like a tempest. Returning to Meridian as CEO would be sweet vindication, certainly. But it would also mean stepping into a company in crisis with demoralized staff, damaged client relationships, and a declining market position. The safe play would be to take one of the competitive offers I'd received. But something Richard had said resonated deeply in my heart. I cared passionately about Meridian's long-term success. The company had been my professional home for 15 devoted years. My team, those who remained, were my people. That night, I called Diane. If I came back to Meridian as CEO, I asked after swearing her to secrecy, would you return? In a heartbeat, she replied without hesitation, her voice thick with emotion. And I could probably bring back at least a dozen others who've left. Is this actually happening? For now, it's confidential, I said, hope surging through me. But maybe not for long. The next morning, I called Richard. I'm in. But I have conditions. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Friday in Meridian's largest conference room. I arrived at 8:30, my heart pounding wildly, entering through a side door Richard had arranged to have unlocked. He met me in a small office adjacent to the conference room. Ready? He asked, his eyes reflecting my own nervous anticipation. I nodded, adjusting my tie. How many board members are confirmed? 4 of 7, he replied with quiet confidence. We have the votes. At precisely 8:55, Richard left to take his place at the table. I waited, listening to the murmur of voices as the room filled. Through the door, I heard Marco call the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming on short notice. Marco began smoothly. As you know, we've faced some challenges with our Asia-Pacific expansion. Today, I'm presenting a strategic restructuring plan to address these issues and put Meridian back on track for growth. I could picture him standing at the head of the table, slides ready, confidence unwavering despite the disaster he'd created. Marco had always been a skilled presenter, if not an effective leader. Before we begin, Richard's voice interrupted. I'd like to propose an amendment to today's agenda. Richard, Marco's tone conveyed forced patience. We agreed on the agenda yesterday. As majority shareholder, I'm exercising my right to amend. Richard continued with calm authority. I'm proposing we first review the company's performance metrics since the leadership changes 3 months ago, then consider an alternative strategic direction. A brief silence, then Marco again. We'll certainly review performance metrics as part of my presentation. I think Richard's suggestion has merit, a female voice interjected. Janet Whitfield, board member and early investor. One of Richard's confirmed allies. Context matters for any restructuring decision. The discussion continued for several tense minutes before Richard's amendment was approved. I heard slides being distributed, then Richard began a methodical presentation of Meridian's declining metrics. Client satisfaction down 15%, implementation failures up 300%, stock price down 23%. Staff turnover at record levels. These are certainly concerning trends, conceded board member Thomas Lee. But what's the alternative you're suggesting, Richard? That was my cue. With a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped into the conference room. The expressions around the table ranged from shock, Marco, to fury, Elliot, to carefully composed neutrality, most board members. Richard continued as if my appearance was entirely expected. I'm proposing a leadership change, he said calmly. Alexander Chen returns as Chief Executive Officer with authority to restructure the executive team and implement the stabilization plan detailed in your packets. Marco recovered quickly, his face flushing with anger. This is absurd. Alex was removed by board vote because his operational approach was outdated for our expansion goals. Actually, Janet cut in sharply, the board approved a restructuring. The specific personnel decisions were presented as operational matters within the CEO's authority. The next hour was tense but methodical. Richard had prepared thoroughly, backing each point with compelling data. 3 major clients had submitted heartfelt letters expressing concern about Meridian's direction and enthusiastic support for my potential return. Financial projections showed the company's troubling trajectory under current leadership versus the stabilization plan. Marco fought back skillfully. defending his decisions passionately and questioning whether my return would truly resolve the underlying issues. Elliot remained largely silent, his expression darkening with each passing minute as the discussion proceeded. When the vote came, it was a decisive 5-2 in favor of the leadership change. Marco and his closest ally opposed. Everyone else, seeing the undeniable evidence, sided with Richard's proposal. Effective immediately, Richard concluded with quiet satisfaction, Alexander Chun will assume the role of Chief Executive Officer. Marco, thank you for your service to Meridian. HR has prepared transition materials for you. Marco stood, straightening his suit jacket, barely containing his fury. This is a catastrophic mistake. You're returning to outdated methods in a rapidly evolving market. He glanced at me coldly. Congratulations, Alex. I hope nostalgia serves you well. After Marco stormed out, Elliot finally spoke, his voice trembling. Uncle Richard, you can't seriously think. Elliot, Richard interrupted firmly, we'll discuss your transition package privately. Please wait for me in my office. When the room had cleared except for Richard and me, I finally sat down, the weight of what had just happened settling on my shoulders. That went as well as could be expected, Richard said, gathering his papers. The real work begins now. I nodded, already mentally cataloging the immediate priorities, reaching out to key clients, reassessing the Asia-Pacific implementation strategy, rebuilding the shattered operations team. I'll announce your appointment to the company at 11, Richard continued. Your office is being prepared now. Any questions before we move forward? Just one, I said, my voice thick with emotion. When Marco fired me at lunch 3 months ago, did you know this might be the outcome? Richard considered the question carefully. I knew Marco was making a catastrophic mistake, he finally replied. Whether the mistake would create an opportunity to correct Meridian's course, that depended entirely on what you did next. He smiled slightly. I've never been disappointed by your follow-through, Alex. My first official act as CEO was to call an all-hands meeting for 2 p.m. Word of the leadership change had already spread through the building like wildfire, with reactions ranging from stunned disbelief to barely concealed jubilation. Before the meeting, I made 3 critical phone calls. The first was to Diane, offering her the position of Chief Operations Officer. Her acceptance took approximately 3 seconds, followed by joyful laughter. The second call was to Kyle, promoting him to VP of Implementation and asking him to focus immediately on salvaging the troubled Asia-Pacific deployments. The third call was to our largest client, Darwin Medical Group, personally assuring them that their implementation issues would be my top priority. At 2 p.m. sharp, I stood before nearly 200 employees in Meridian's largest meeting space. Many faces showed cautious optimism. Others, particularly those hired during Elliot's brief tenure, displayed understandable anxiety. 3 months ago, I left this company under heartbreaking circumstances. I began, my voice steady despite the emotions swelling within me. Today, I return as CEO with a simple mission to restore Meridian to its core principles of operational excellence and client success. Over the next 30 minutes, I outlined my immediate priorities, acknowledged the daunting challenges ahead, and emphasized that our people were Meridian's greatest treasure. I announced Diane's triumphant return as COO, prompting spontaneous applause from the operations teams. In the coming days, we will be reassessing all aspects of our organization, I concluded passionately. Some changes will be necessary, but they will be made thoughtfully with full transparency and deep respect for the contributions each of you makes to our success. The questions afterward were direct, sometimes pointed, but I answered each one honestly. Yes, some recent hires would be evaluated based on performance and organizational needs. No, we weren't abandoning the Asia-Pacific expansion, but we would be adjusting timelines to ensure quality. Yes, we would be bringing back key team members who had left in recent months. As the meeting concluded, Kyle approached me, hand extended, his eyes bright with renewed hope. Welcome back, Alex. Or should I say Mr. CEO now? I smiled, clasping his hand warmly. Just Alex is fine. How bad is the Darwin implementation? A complete nightmare, he admitted with a weary sigh. But fixable. With your approval, I've already reached out to their CTO to schedule an emergency review. Make it happen, I nodded decisively. Whatever resources you need. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where the emergency board meeting had taken place, but under vastly different circumstances. Meridian's quarterly results had just been released, showing the first growth period since before my departure. Client retention had rebounded to 95%, still short of our historic 97%, but trending steadily upward. The Asia-Pacific expansion, now properly staffed and paced, had secured 12 new enterprise clients. Richard entered, reviewing the numbers on his tablet with evident satisfaction. Impressive turnaround, he said warmly. The board is thrilled. It's a promising start, I replied with cautious optimism. We've stabilized, but we're still rebuilding. Another 6 months before we're fully back on track. He set down the tablet. Marco has taken a CEO position with a competitor in California. I heard. I wish them the best of luck. My voice was neutral. Richard chuckled knowingly. No, you don't. I smiled slightly. You're right, I don't. I paused. Any word from Elliot? He's joined a startup in Boston. Something in fintech. Richard's expression was unreadable, masking family pain. Family dinners are somewhat tense these days. I nodded, understanding the personal cost of difficult business decisions.